Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you. My name's Chris. I'm the Senior Minister at Andover Community Church and also the Director of Partner Church Development for the Further Faster Network. And I have been looking forward to this event for quite a long time. A number of us around the network and in our churches and in our church here have been really enjoying Justin Brierley's book and podcast, Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and have found it already to be significant in our thinking. One of the things we're passionate about as a network at the Further Faster Network is equipping and inspiring churches to be places that value and include and welcome unchurched people, people who don't have a faith or who are exploring faith. And Justin and the work that he's done are, I think, hugely significant in our thinking around that subject. So Justin, a huge welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us and for being willing to take time to be with us this afternoon. We so appreciate it. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to sharing a bit over the next hour and a half.
Brilliant, thank you. So just as I've said, as people have been joining, a couple of practicalities this afternoon. If you have questions, please stick them into the chat. And Justin is going to be presenting for between 20 minutes and half an hour or so as we begin our time together. Then we've got a few questions that we're going to do a little bit of sort of interview back and forth as I ask Justin a few questions. And then we're going to open it up and invite others to ask their questions too. So if you have questions, then please do stick them in the chat. And when we get to that section of our time together, we'll call you in and ask you to put that question to Justin. So Justin, over to you. Thanks again for being with us, and can't wait to hear what you're going to be sharing with us.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'll just share some slides from my screen that will just help to illustrate what's going on as we go. But thanks everyone for coming on the call. And as I said, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to say a bit about the book and the new podcast as well, which I don't know, perhaps some of you have been able to either read or listen to the new podcast. The book itself released in September last year, and the podcast has been going for just a few months, since about November of last year. So I've been really thrilled at the response to it. But today I just wanted to share kind of some of the themes really from the book and the new podcast documentary series. I start the book with a quote from a well-known poem, Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, which reads like this: "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." And these were words that Matthew Arnold wrote back in the Victorian era, so about 150 years ago. And if anything, his prediction of the withdrawing roar of the sea of faith has only accelerated, obviously, in the time since, as we've seen increasing secularization, de-Christianization, and so on. But I had an interesting conversation with a quite well-known public thinker, quite a conservative thinker, Douglas Murray, a few years ago on my Unbelievable show. And he said something which kind of was almost the catalyst really for this book and series, because he referenced that well-worn line about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And he said, but the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is it could come back in again. That is the point of tides. And it got me thinking, actually, yes, I wonder whether we might be due for the sea of faith not to simply withdraw, but to come in again. And this was in the context of Douglas himself talking about the fact that he had met a number of interesting people, friends, colleagues of his, secular people who had rather surprisingly embraced Christian faith, not in their masses, but certainly some interesting examples, that stood out for him. And Douglas Murray himself is an interesting person because he had a faith of sorts until his early 20s, when it sort of faded off, basically. And he very much became part of what became the New Atheist sort of glitterati, a group of interesting intellectual scientists, journalists who were very much kind of dismissing religion. But some years on from that, he now describes himself, interestingly, as a Christian atheist, because he told me that he just thinks the New Atheist project has essentially failed. and that he thinks that we can't do without something like Christianity to make sense of life, to make sense of our culture, certainly. And that's why he describes himself as a Christian atheist, because he's simply aware that all of his moral instincts really do come from Christianity, not from his atheism. So that was interesting, and it kind of did kind of spur me into think about, well, what if we are due to see some kind of rebirth of belief in God? Because I too had bumped into a surprising number of people who, against all the odds, were coming to faith. And one swallow doesn't make a summer, but I did think there was an interesting sort of something interesting happening, even if only anecdotally. So the background to all of this is, of course, that there has been this increasing secularization in the West, and perhaps the cherry on top of that cake has been the new atheism, which many of you will know was a sort of movement that really took shape in the mid-2000s, led by the so-called four horsemen of the new atheism, from left to right there: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. Each had their own best-selling anti-God book, perhaps most famously Richard Dawkins, Oxford biologist, and his book, The God Delusion. But this was a time when, you know, it felt like atheism was very cool. You know, there were lots of op-eds and media attention, kind of dismissing religion, saying there's no evidence for God, religion is bad for you. That was the nature of these books and the TV programs and other things that were circulating. There was even the atheist bus campaign as well. You might remember that in London, when buses circulated the capital bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So this was a kind of high watermark for very kind of quite aggressive form of atheism, certainly one that was very dismissive of religion. And that was the way things stood. And really my own conversations on faith were birthed into that environment. I hosted a show called Unbelievable for 17 and a half years, and it started in 2005, really when this new atheism was really building up a head of steam. The God Delusion was about to be published. Lots of these quite full-on debates, you know, then occurred between these atheist figures and some Christian thinkers. I featured a lot of those on the show over the years. And it was really interesting, you know, to be sort of the moderator and sitting on the sidelines of a number of these discussions. But over time, the conversations did change. And the picture you've got in front of you is once we started going not only on radio and podcast, but also doing a video channel, YouTube, and so on. And this was in 2018. I recorded a show between Jordan Peterson, quite a well-known Canadian psychology professor, and Susan Blackmore, an atheist psychologist. And they were debating the question, do we need God to make sense of life? The interesting thing in this case was that while I normally brought a Christian and a non-Christian on to debate the issues, in this case, it was effectively two non-Christians, because Jordan Peterson, it would be difficult to describe him as a conventional Christian. And but yet he was essentially occupying the chair of the Christian apologist. And you could have been forgiven if you'd just been casually listening to this discussion that he was a kind of Christian, because of the way he defended the kind of the need for God in our culture and so on. And this was just one example of the way in which I was seeing the conversation change quite dramatically from those early years of the show, when it really was, you know, these bombastic debates between these hardline atheists versus Christian thinkers, to suddenly finding a lot more atheists coming on, or non-believers, who were distancing themselves from the new atheism, saying, I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist. And in fact, a lot of these secular thinkers actually being quite sympathetic and open to the value of Christianity and so on in the West. People like Douglas Murray, people like Jordan Peterson, who we'll come on to again later. And I just noticed a shift in the conversation. And so that really, you know, again, was part of the catalyst for writing this book. My first book, Unbelievable, which is the one on the right there, kind of was my case for faith, you know, at about the 10-year mark of hosting these conversations. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God is very much me kind of saying, well, how has that conversation changed over time? And perhaps as a church, as Christians, do we need to be ready to answer a different set of questions than perhaps the new atheists had? Because I think the question people are asking has changed as the tone of the conversation has changed. So that's what you'll find really in the book, and the subtitle, as it says there, is Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. And we kind of do a much more deep dive, long form documentary version of that in this new podcast documentary series as well, that you can find wherever you get your podcast from. So that's just sort of some of the background really to the whole thing. And maybe just, with the remaining time, one way I found helpful to get into this is to look at three specific areas where I think the conversation has been changing from that kind of very new atheist, materialist sort of way of looking at life and the universe to some of the new thinkers who are coming on the scene, these secular thinkers, people who aren't necessarily Christians, but who are pointing people back towards God and towards Christianity. And so there's three particular areas where I think the God conversation has taken some fascinating turns in recent years. Partly it's because, as I've said, the new atheism sort of waned, and I won't go into detail on that. If you want to read it or listen to the podcast, you'll get a much fuller explanation of why new atheism, I think, faded out, essentially, because ultimately it wasn't answering people's fundamental questions. But what we have seen in its place is a lot of these new thinkers who are willing to give Christianity a second look and opening the door, I think, to a lot of people to take Christianity seriously again. The first area where I think we're seeing this happen is in the area of science, and the idea of what it takes for us humans to be here. This is an area some of you might be familiar with, but for a long time, there's been a really interesting kind of journey going on in the scientific community, I think, away from that kind of faith contradicts science kind of view that the new atheists were very much banging the drum for, towards actually a sense that actually there is something that, if you like, lives outside of science, something that you need to explain science itself, certainly something that needs to explain why humans are here. And so a number of, the scientists that I've spoken to over the years, both Christian and non-Christian, have talked about a phenomenon called the fine-tuning of the universe for life, something that some of you may have come across before. But essentially this idea that the fundamental constants and values that the universe was birthed with are incredibly finely dialed to just the right precision they need to be to allow for chemistry, atoms, electrons, just for galaxies, stars, planets to exist where life could potentially come about. And that has been a remarkable discovery of the last several decades, this fine tuning of the universe for life. On top of that, you've got all kinds of other points in what it took for humans to be here that seem to be crying out for an explanation beyond just a purely naturalistic, it was just a fluke kind of a cosmic chance event. The actual genesis of life on Earth, again, seems to defy the odds mathematically on that front. The fact of consciousness, the fact that we are self-aware creatures, the fact that not only that, but that we can reflect on ourselves and start to explore the universe around us. These are not necessarily things you would expect in a universe that is essentially boils down to blind chance. So who are the kinds of people saying this? Is it just Christians? Well, certainly not, actually. What I've discovered more and more is that more and more secular thinkers who are interested in these questions are kind of asking whether there's a purpose behind it all. I was on a call just the other day to a significant philosopher of mind called Philip Goff, who, again, not a Christian, but someone who's just written a book saying that actually there is a purpose behind the universe. Now, he doesn't come to a specifically Christian conclusion, but it's very different to the sort of story that the new atheists have told for a long time, that we basically live in this purposeless, deterministic universe. Another interesting thinker on this, I'll skip to the next slide, sorry. I think it's gonna go, there we go. Paul Davies, he's a Brit, but he lives out in the US, and he's founded the Origins Center at Arizona State University. He's a physicist, but he dabbles in other sciences as well. And he's written some really popular books. He's hosted TV series. And when I've had him in conversation a few times, he's been a bit of a thorn in the side of the new atheists because he's not a religious person himself, but he refuses this idea that there's no purpose behind the universe, because the way he looks at the universe, the way he sees the way things unfold and what it took for us to be here, he just says that that doesn't stack up. That I like the way he put it at one point. He said this to me in a conversation that we had. I can find the quote. He says, the directionality in the universe going from matter to life to consciousness. He said, I would add comprehension to that. There's an arrow of time in the direction of comprehension. And if that is the case, if this is not just an enormous fluke, a happy series of accidents, then that to me comes very close to something like a meaning or purpose in nature. I think that's a sort of religious feeling, what Einstein called a cosmic religious feeling. So that's about as close as Paul Davies can get to describing this fact of the universe, the directionality he sees towards us, towards consciousness, and us being able to understand our place in the universe. That's as close as he gets to calling it God. But I think actually what he's described there, this sort of principle of order, meaning, and life coming out of essentially non-meaning and chaos, you could use a Greek word to describe that, the word logos. And that is, of course, the word that is used at the beginning of John's gospel, this idea of the word speaking, meaning, order, life into existence. And I think it's really fascinating when you've got people, secular people like Paul Davies, kind of talking in ways that just seem to map really well, actually, onto the Christian story of reality. So for me, there is no conflict, certainly, between science and faith. In fact, there's a real complementarity. And I think as we've moved away from those new atheist tropes about, science conflicting with faith, I think there's some really interesting new conversations going on about the way that actually people like Paul Davies and others are kind of pointing people back towards some kind of ultimate meaning or purpose behind the universe. So that's just one area which I open up a bit in the book. We haven't got to those issues in the podcast yet, but you will hear more about that in future editions of the podcast. Another area where I think there's interesting conversations and a sort of turning of the tide, if you like. I like to think that one of the ways to think about this is that tide that Matthew Arnold spoke of going out, we might just be starting to see the beginning of it turning. I'm not saying that we've got a rush of people coming back towards Christianity at this point, but certainly it feels like something's changed in the atmosphere and the tide of faith might be turning. And again, one of the areas where I think I've seen a lot of people talking about this is the question of human value. One conversation I had at Oxford University back in sort of the heyday of the new atheism, I think this was in 2008, I actually managed to have a sort of recorded conversation with Richard Dawkins after an event he had had with John Lennox at the Natural History Museum in Oxford. And this is how our conversation went. I said to him, look, Richard, if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he said, well, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine, where failure to pay your debts, failures to reciprocate favors is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad. That's a value judgment. Glad that I live in such a society. And I said, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say the reason that this is good is that it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement? To which he replied, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. I said, so therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. And Richard replied, well, you could say that. In any case, there's nothing about it that makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural. To which I said, okay, but ultimately your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that. Yes. And I think you could say that. And actually, you probably should say that if you're a thoroughgoing naturalist atheist like Richard Dawkins, because that, if you like, is the consistent thing to say in that worldview. But most of us, atheists or Christians, recoil at this idea that our belief that rape is wrong is just the happenstance of the hand that evolution happens to have dealt us in this time and place, as though that we could easily have thought something different, and that would have then just been our standard morality. We actually think there's something true about the idea that there are certain ways humans should and shouldn't treat each other. So that kind of sense that there is a real objective moral realm, there's a real thing called human value, human dignity, that when it's transgressed, something bad has happened. That's something that I think requires an explanation outside of a purely kind of socio-biological evolutionary explanation. And I think a lot of other people have been starting to realize that too, that the kind of the atheist account of morality and human value doesn't really hold water. Now, one of the people I think who's been pointing this out in really interesting ways is Tom Holland, who has featured on the podcast at various points. And for those who don't know, Tom is a historian. He co-hosts a really popular history podcast, The Rest is History, with Dominic Sandbrook. And he has increasingly been speaking and writing on the way that the Christian Revolution 2000 years ago has completely shaped all our moral and cultural instincts in the West. So his big book on this, of course, is Dominion, which I can highly recommend if you are ready to go through the 600-700 pages of it. But there's some really good, actually, sort of short treatments of it as well. People like Glenn Scrivener, his book, The Air We Breathe, is a brilliant kind of entry-level version almost of Dominion as well. But I've tried to kind of express some of his ideas as well in my own book and in the podcast. But Tom Holland himself has gone on a really fascinating journey, because he's someone who, you know, had a kind of nominal Christian upbringing, but it has sort of fizzled out by his teenage years. Was a kind of happy secular liberal until he started to research the ancient Greeks and Romans, because he was starting to write these really popular history books about that era. And what he discovered was that although he found this era fascinating, interesting, he also found it quite alien to his own way of thinking, because this was a place where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, absolutely unquestioned. A place where certain people could be the sexual property of other people, a place where the lives of women and children were cheap, a place where when Caesar, you know, goes through the streets of Rome in his pomp and circumstance to celebrate his victories, he is celebrated for the fact that he slaughtered 1 million Gauls and enslaved a further million, something we would call a genocide today. So he was sort of, he had this cognitive dissonance of, why are their values and ways of life so very different to mine? And he realized, the reason I believe in equality and freedom, human dignity, human rights, progress, that didn't come from the Greeks and Romans. And it didn't come from science, and it didn't come from atheism. He realized where it came from was Christianity. And this was the big revelation for Tom Holland. And increasingly, he started to see the way in which almost every aspect of modern Western culture has some way been infused by the Christian Revolution, has been transformed by the Christian Revolution. And again, he's become a really interesting sort of thorn in the sides of certain secular humanists, when he's reminding his peers, you know, that essentially all of their belief in human rights and dignity and value really are Christian beliefs. They're fundamentally theological beliefs. There's nothing, you know, if you cut a person open and look at them with a microscope, you won't find this thing called human rights. They're an invention, says Tom. They were invented by this story about Christianity that says there's a God in whose image you were created. Now, Tom himself has been on an interesting journey himself in that regard, you know, and you'll hear that teased out a little bit in the podcast and in the book. If anyone's around, I'm doing a conversation with Tom on Tuesday, the 5th of March in London at Westminster Chapel. And I think we'll hear more probably about his own journey here. But certainly he's been on this intellectual journey. And I think what that's revealed to him is that he's very attracted actually at a sort of emotional and spiritual level to Christianity as well. But he's sort of, it's sometimes difficult to pin down exactly where he finds himself on that. But this is interesting to me just because he has such a huge audience. And I've heard so many people say how much they've been influenced in kind of just reassessing the value of Christianity because of Tom Holland. So here's another interesting speaker. Time doesn't allow to really go into detail with some of these folk, but Louise Perry is another very interesting person who I featured recently on the podcast, certainly gets a mention in the book, who in her case is someone who, again, came from a very sort of liberal progressive background when it came to her views on feminism, sexuality, relationships, and so on. But really her views kind of got transformed in the process of sort of being involved in a rape crisis center. And she started to do some research into really what the effects of the sexual revolution have been upon women, especially. And she wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, in which she kind of, to her own surprise, came to surprisingly Christian conclusions that actually this old fuddy-duddy institution that the sexual revolution tried to do away with, monogamous marriage, has actually historically been the safest bet for people to put sexuality within, in terms of flourishing people, flourishing societies, flourishing cultures. And so she, again, has become an interesting voice, particularly around the issue of sexual ethics, coming again from a sort of secular perspective, but arriving at interestingly Christian conclusions. And again, I think she's going on an interesting journey herself spiritually. So these are just some of the people, you know, talking about human value, human dignity, human relationships, who I think are the new people. These are the people who I think a lot of secular folk are now listening to, rather than Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett and so on. I feel like there's been a turning of the tide in terms of the kinds of voices. And a lot of these people are very sympathetic to Christianity. Just one final area where I think we're seeing a change. It's the question of human purpose, I suppose, because I think tied in with all this, there has been a growing meaning crisis in the West that's been fueled by not just the loss of a Christian story and the sense of meaning and purpose that once gave people. I think it's been accelerated by the internet, by technology, and the fact that we now live in a culture essentially, whereas we've lost the Christian story, people are now having to find other stories, invent their own stories really from scratch to make sense of who they are. And I think we're seeing this meaning crisis develop because we're not made to basically invent our own identity and our own story. It's an intolerable burden actually on people. And I think especially you see this in the younger generation, where we are seeing this mental health crisis, anxiety rates, depression, suicide, sadly, at an all-time high among men. And I think it's an identity crisis. It's a sense of who am I? What am I here for? And I think that's really intensified in the last several years. And I think we're seeing a lot of secular psychologists recognizing this meaning crisis. And interestingly, a number of them again asking, well, maybe it's time to look back at the story we've put in the back mirror, the Christian story that once did give people their meaning, their purpose, and their identity for so many millennia. Now, one obvious example of someone doing this is Jordan Peterson. He's a bit of a controversial character. You know, he's got some hot political takes if you're on Twitter. But if you actually go and watch him in a lecture on his YouTube platform and other places, you'll find that he actually has some very interesting ideas to share. And really, he built his popularity, his cult popularity, on the back of literally just speaking on the book of Genesis for 3 hours at a time in theaters in Canada, and just thousands of young people, especially young men, turning up to hear him. And then his star has continued to rise. He's become extremely popular online and elsewhere, and just enormously, enormously persuasive and enormously influential to a large demographic of people. And these are people who are looking for meaning, looking for purpose, trying to make sense of their life in the age we live in. And for whatever reason, they're attracted to the vision of reality that Jordan Peterson sketches out. And it's a vision of reality that's very much informed by the Christian worldview. He's constantly pointing people back to the Bible. He's constantly talking about the Bible. Now, it's a bit tricky sometimes to work out exactly where he falls on the God question, because he sees everything through this very psychological Jungian lens. But nonetheless, whatever you think of his personal take on God and theology, there's no doubt that he is kind of opening up the question for people again. I've met so many people who have started to give faith a second look because of Jordan Peterson. He's opening the door, and I know a lot of people who have walked through that door to Orthodox Christian faith. I don't know where Jordan Peterson is exactly on that journey. There's some interesting suggestions that he may be sort of ready to make some kind of a commitment, you know, outside of kind of Jungian, this is very useful psychologically kind of way of thinking about it. But certainly I know lots of people who have been very influenced towards Christian faith because of him. So again, here's an interesting character who I think is part of this movement, this rebirth, I think, of belief in God, the conversations that he is having are so different to the ones that the new atheists were having only 15 or 20 years ago. It's almost difficult to imagine. You know, I was at the O2 Arena in London with my son when he came to speak there in November, and, you know, 13,000 people turning up to hear him speak about, you know, purpose, meaning, the Bible, God. And it's the same people who were turning out for the new atheists, I'm sure, you know, 15 or 20 years ago. It's the same demographic at least. So something has changed. And you know, Peterson is one among a number of people. More recently, you might have come across this story. This happened after the book got published, but you can hear about it on the podcast. But a fascinating example in Ayaan Hirsi Ali, herself a former new atheist. So this is the Somali-born Dutch sort of thinker, politician who came out of a fundamentalist Islam background in Somalia and very much became in the mid-2000s part of that new atheist cadre of thinkers, sort of dismissing religion, saying we need to return to sort of reason and everything else. But she had this fascinating article come out in, I think it was November, for Unheard, which went viral, which was titled "Why I Am Now a Christian." And in it, she details why she has embraced Christianity. She says the atheist project has failed. She lists a number of reasons why she thinks that it cannot provide the kind of buffer we need against things like fundamentalist Islam, or what she sees as a kind of woke ideologies that are threatening from the left, or the big worrying things like China and Putin's Russia and so on. She says secular materialism is just too weak, and she thinks we need to re-embrace Christianity. Again, very influenced, interestingly, by Tom Holland. Now, this caused a lot of sort of interest, controversy, response from both Christians and atheists, saying, well, isn't this just, a kind of cultural embrace of Christianity, politically motivated sort of thing? And yes, there's no doubt that her article absolutely spells out political and cultural reasons why she would want to embrace Christianity. But there was also definitely a spiritual element to this. She talks about how atheism simply didn't offer meaning and purpose in life. And if you go and watch some of the subsequent interviews she did for Unheard, you'll find more about that personal journey she's been on. And it's been a very interesting one, I think. So again, I don't know exactly where she lands, but it is really interesting, I think, to see kind of happening in real time the thesis of my book, which I just published, suddenly seeing Ayaan Hirsi Ali come out with this article, Why I'm Now a Christian. I just thought, gosh, maybe this really is, maybe I'm onto something here. Maybe there's something going on. And I do feel there is something going on. Something has changed in the atmosphere. And I suppose the question that leaves for church leaders like yourselves is kind of, I won't talk about Molly Worthen. If I get a chance in the Q&A, I'll mention her story as well. But if there is something happening, how should we be responding to it? Sometimes I think the church sometimes gets caught answering yesterday's questions when actually there are new questions being asked. I've probably moved myself when it comes to my own work in apologetics from doing quite so much of that traditional apologetics, 4 arguments for the resurrection, 5 reasons to believe in God, to kind of moving into this more cultural apologetics area. I think because I'm sensing that most people aren't waking up and asking, does God exist? They're waking up and asking, how do I make sense of life? Why do I feel so depressed? Give me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And I think that's where the conversation probably needs to turn, because actually it's these sort of existential questions and these deeper longings around meaning and purpose that I think are actually what's being expressed in the culture at the moment. So I think the church needs to be ready to answer those kinds of questions. And perhaps we need to take a leaf out of the book of people like Jordan Peterson, who, as I say, are drawing huge crowds of young men, especially to long lectures on the Bible. This would be most preachers' dream if they could fill their churches in that way for their sermons. But ask, well, why? Why is he having that kind of effect? I think it's because he is zeroing in on this existential itch that there is among people today who are feeling like secular materialism, they might not call it that, but that is the water in which they swim. They just feel that's let them down. It's not fulfilling its promises. And they're looking for a different story. And they're often trying to fill their lives with lots of other stories, but those stories are letting them down. Because when you put anything other than the Christian story, God, at the center, you'll find that it's just another false idol. So I think there's an opportunity here for the church to speak into this new phenomena, this new movement. We often, obviously see the statistics around church and religious affiliation, and it's all on a downward trend in the West. But I don't think God's finished with the church, and I don't think God's finished. Sometimes things have to die off before they're reborn. And I just wonder whether we're in one of those turning of the tide moments. And I think we should be optimistic, prayerful, hopeful that God is doing something new and that we can be part of it. So thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed the little presentation, and look forward to hearing some questions.
Great. Justin, that's so helpful. Thank you. And just before we get into the Q&A, just want to encourage people once again to check out the podcast and the book, both of which are hugely helpful. And we'll post some links in the chat as we go through the Q&A and before we finish today to Justin's website and where you can get all those resources from. So I'm going to lead in with a couple of questions, and then we've already getting some in the chat. So we'll link into those as well. If you have questions over the next few minutes, please stick them in the live chat, and we'll see how many we can get to. Justin, I really wanted to start with this. You kind of sort of drew into it a little bit as you finished there with this big story stuff, because that was one of the things that really struck me. First of all, is a great explanation for why we're seeing this cultural angst at the moment, and these culture wars, this kind of search for a bigger story idea. But also, of course, as Christians and churches, we have this big story that seems to provide so many answers to the questions people are asking. So I think you've already touched upon it a little bit. Would you just unpack that a little bit more? How we take this big overarching narrative that is the Christian story and bring that to people who, whether they know it or not, desperately need that big overarching story. I just thought it was one of the amazing things about the Death of New Atheism episode was that what that singly failed to do was provide a bigger story. And I think you say in that episode, human beings are not built to live without a bigger story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that was one of the reasons why the New Atheism has waned, actually, is because they tore God down, but they didn't erect anything to replace God, because science and reason alone can't do that job. They're not the right tools, if you like, to build a meaningful life. And so I think what it did effectively, actually, and I think a lot of the New Atheists themselves are now recognizing this, it sort of swept the floor clean for all kinds of other stories to come in. So rather than this sort of rationalistic atheist utopia that I think they naively assumed would replace that old Christian story, it's been all kinds of other stories. And a lot of them are very concerned, actually, now, because, you know, you've got Richard Dawkins getting very concerned about transgender and that kind of thing, because those are the sort of sacred stories that people now sort of use in the place of God. This is my identity. This is the thing that gives me meaning. This is the you know, and as I said earlier, I think the problem is, whatever you think of those stories, none of them are enough. And they're all competing as well with other people's stories. And so you get the culture wars, and you get this kind of basically breakdown, really, in the culture. And the question, I suppose, for us is, can the Christian story can we show that the Christian story is actually the bigger story that people are looking for, that all those other stories are just sort of pale reflections of in some way? And I think that is possible. I think some people have done this very well over, you know, the years and centuries. I mean, C.S. Lewis is a great example of someone who was able to imaginatively help people to imagine a story that could make sense of their life, because he wrote amazing stories himself, which reflected the Christian story. So the Narnia story is obviously a classic example of that, where he wasn't doing, in a sense, traditional apologetics there, but he was giving people a sense of what it might look like to live in a world where there is truth and beauty and goodness, and a person at the center of it who kind of embodies all of that, and to whom you can give your allegiance and see yourself in the light of. So I think there are ways that the church can do that. I think in the end, for me, we are made to live in the Christian story, because it's the only story where we're given absolute sense of meaning, purpose, and identity, because we are made in the image of God. We are put here for a reason, and life is difficult and tough, but we believe in a God who came to experience that with us and to be part of it, and who ultimately, through his death and resurrection, sort of invites us into a story that is far bigger than we could ever have hoped on ourselves. And that sense of purpose going on, you know, into the future. There's a story there that is incredibly deep and rich. And the challenge, I think, for Christians is to help people to engage that story again. It was, I think, in ages gone by, it was so sort of permeated the culture anyway. It wasn't so hard to kind of make people see themselves as part of their story. They almost automatically kind of lived into just the assumptions. As that story's faded from view, I think now we have to do a lot more, in a sense, to remind people that actually a lot of their the things they do believe actually find their foundation in the Christian story. That's, as I say, why Tom Holland is kind of an interesting person in this regard, reminding people that their belief in human rights, the atheist story of reality cannot account for that. It just can't. But the Christian story of reality does make perfect sense of that belief. And I think we're at this interesting moment where suddenly people kind of are having to choose, well, which story of reality am I going to sort of align myself with here? And can the secular material story of reality really sustain my deepest beliefs? Because there are other stories kind of now vying for our attention as the Christian story has waned, and the advent of social media. I see some positive, for instance, in the way Jordan Peterson is kind of trying to reach young men with a message that kind of is more infused with a Christian view of reality. But there are other actors out there. There are the Andrew Tates of this world who have huge audiences of young men, but it's a very anti-Christian view of masculinity and life that they're offering. They're offering a very different story. That they're actually, I think they're going back to more of a pagan story, where it's basically might is right, and if you the guy with the biggest harem basically wins. And so for me, I think it's really important at this moment when people are kind of being forced to decide, well, what story do we believe in, to, in whatever way, as creatively, imaginatively, as compellingly as we can, offer again the Christian story as a way of making sense of that sense people have that they're at a crossroads in some way.
Thank you. And do you think how much of the changing conversation amongst academics, thinkers, and that kind of stuff, do you think is motivated by a desire to hold on to a cultural thing, kind of Western culture, if we put it like that, versus a kind of genuine re-examining of not just the cultural aspects of Christianity and what it's brought to the world, but a potential relationship with a savior of the world? What's your sense in the sort of balance between that?
I think there are different, some of these different people I mentioned, I think, are at different points on that spectrum. And I think there are probably some who are interested in the benefits of religion and Christianity almost purely from a cultural kind of conservative perspective. They're people who want the kind of the order, the structure, the values, but they're not really interested in whether it's true. In the end, they just want the benefits of it, the fruits without the roots, as it were. And I don't know, I might arguably say, someone like a psychologist like Jonathan Haidt, it might fall into that category. He's explicitly says he's not religious. He's not particularly that interested in being religious, but he absolutely sees the value of religion. So he's one of those people who says it's a useful fiction, essentially. So that's, there's that one person who's at least saying religion's actually good for us, but I don't believe it's true. And then you've got people who are somewhere in the middle. Maybe Douglas Murray fits here, where he says, I absolutely believe Christianity is absolutely useful because we need something like Christianity to make sense of life. But he himself is a kind of conflicted agnostic. He would really like this story to be true, but he just can't seem to find quite a way of leaping into it. And again, he sees the cultural value, but he's like very kind of, just not sure if I can kind of go there. And then I think you've got people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who, I think absolutely has that cult, sees the cultural value of Christianity, but appears to have jumped in and seems to be saying, actually, I'm going to invest myself in this story and kind of really put my weight on it and see what happens. And then you've got, and then there's plenty of other people I could have mentioned who I think have kind of gone the whole hog and have just sort of bought into Christianity wholesale. People like Paul Kingsnorth, for instance, who I talk about in the book, who's a very interesting sort of, at one time at least, secular writer and poet, now a very committed Christian, who I think just came to a point when he converted in 2021, a big surprise both to him and to his big audience, who just decided, there is no better story. And there were all kinds of things in his life that he just couldn't deny were basically bringing him to Christ. And I find stories like that really interesting. That there's people all along this spectrum, but a really surprising number who are really actually leaping in, even in our very post-Christian skeptical age. And I find that quite encouraging. So it could go off in different directions, and there's absolutely, I think, going to be manifestations of this which are ultimately more, utilitarian, and probably that we should be very wary of. But I think there's also something going on that is definitely of God, and it is kind of the spirit that's happening.
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting. The latest episode, I think it is, with Tom Holland, and you spend quite a lot of time in that episode of the podcast, really digging around in Tom Holland's story, which I thought was really interesting. One of the things, and I wonder if this is something that we're going to increasingly see, particularly people who are thinking and reading and reflecting. Tom Holland is clearly academically brilliant, and it seems that the thing that's stretching him in regards to sort of fully committing to Christianity as a way for him to live by is the sort of the mystery bit of it, or the spiritual bit of it. You can hear it through the podcast, I think, and in your conversation with him, that he's almost desperate to take the plunge, as it were, but his rational bit is struggling to cope with the mystery bit. Is that fair? And do you think that's common?
I think it is. And another guest who I had on recently, featured in the podcast, Louise Perry, who I mentioned as well, said almost exactly that thing to me when I came on her podcast. She said, I'm really attracted to Christianity, but I think my disenchanted brain really struggles with the metaphysics, was the way she put it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's probably going to be different for every individual. I think there's a degree to which, I think especially in the evangelical church, we need to be a little bit wary of kind of expecting everyone to kind of basically sign on the dotted line, if you like, of a set of beliefs and propositions. Because in my experience, for some people, they don't go, the journey doesn't happen in that way. It's much more that they're being drawn towards something which, as you say, is quite mysterious, which they would struggle to kind of just intellectually rationalize at some level. And I think it's okay to let people be in that place. And that might be the only place they find they can get to, but where it is a kind of an acceptance on a kind of very sort of just gut level. This is the way I want the world to be. So I'm almost going to pretend this is the way the world, despite my intellectual kind of, doubts, if you like. And I think that's when I've had conversations with Tom, that's where he's at. He said, look, I suspect he's kind of person will say, look, I'm never going to get to a sort of full intellectual sort of, realization of every claim of Christianity. But I just know I really love this story, and I love, and I to that extent, I think, different people may have different sort of ideas as to whether that counts as being a Christian. But for me, I think we have to have the grace to see that people are going to encounter Christ in different ways. And it's not always going to be a sort of, every intellectual question is sort of laid out and sort of signed off in that way. There's going to, it's for a lot of people, I think, they're probably for their whole life, they might sort of be a mixture of doubt and faith, and kind of like, oh, Tom Holland says, today I'm not sure if they can believe it, but he still turns up at church, and he still, takes communion, and he still does, and so I guess it's something like that, that's going on for me, that we need to have grace for people who struggle to kind of put it all together at that level.
Yeah. So I'm gonna move into one of the questions we've been asked, actually, which is about Tom and about how he's experiencing and encountering God. So this comes from Becky, who is part of our team here at Andover, actually, and they're sitting upstairs here at the moment. They can't. It's going to be difficult. They're waving now. It's going to be difficult to call them in because they're all there's a big team there. So I'm going to ask. Oh, there they all are. So I'm going to ask Becky's question that she sent in. First of all, she says, Justin, I'm an avid listener of your podcast, finding it massively encouraging. One thing I haven't been able to get my head around is Tom Holland's take on the most and least compelling versions of Christianity in our world today, as talked about on the podcast. It seems like the value and continued importance of Christianity from his perspective has primarily been the introduction of a new ethic and a new way of life. originating with historical Jesus and crucifixion. And yet the version of Christianity he says he finds most compelling today is an ethereal Anglo-Catholic expression of liturgical worship, which you could say is a tradition that doesn't really major today on ethics and how you live, it majors on the ways of worship, which it could be argued come more from Rome than they do from the historical Jesus. So I was having spent time with Tom, can you shed a bit more light on why you think he's more inclined towards these more mysterious expressions of Christian worship in churches that are trying to present applicable biblical teaching? What do you think, from speaking to people like Tom, Christians should lean into to present the way of Jesus in a compelling way? Which kind of just to sort of add a little bit to that, one of the questions that I had on to ask is the interesting growth in both Pentecostal and High Church Orthodox traditions we're seeing in our culture, which seem at opposite extremes maybe of a style and way of worship. And I think this is what Becky's alluded to as well. And why do you think we're seeing that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I get the question, and thank you for it. I think it is a really interesting one. It was one I haven't quite put together in that way. So it's really interesting to hear you say it. So there's no doubt that the stream that Tom Holland finds most attractive in terms of the worship style is the Anglo-Catholic style. And yes, arguably you could say that is the stream that is, less concerned with, ethics and I suppose perhaps the kind of cultural sort of aspect of bringing Christianity into the fore. I don't know. I mean, I would say that probably, the people I see Tom actually talking to most frequently, interestingly, when it comes to Christians, are actually evangelical Christians. And that may be just because evangelical Christians kind of are the most excited by, like I am, Tom Holland kind of saying nice things about Christianity or something. But so I don't think it's that he's in any way antagonistic or dismissing that stream. I think he sees it as very important. I think he sees Christianity as having sort of being expressed in all of these different places in ways that for him are very important. It's just at a personal level, I think he just finds the beauty and the mystery of that kind of choral evensong sort of, and something that is obviously, as a historian, deeply connected to the past, that. So I think the reason he prefers, hearing the Magnificat over, the drums and guitars, that you might find at the local evangelical church, is about his kind of personal leanings at a historical and aesthetic level, because he wants to kind of feel like he's part of that tradition. Though I think when you hear him talk about what he would like Christians to do in the culture, he is actually quite out there and says, look, don't water it down, like be distinctive, because I don't want to just like platitudinous thought of the day kind of, stuff. I can get that from the culture already, to give me something different. So I think and so partly the reason he goes to the ancient churches is because that is different, because that is, that's out of the ordinary. It's kind of takes you out of the everyday. But at the same time, I think he also wants Christians to be a bit bolder with their messaging, and not just kind of make it just a sort of, let's just try and fit in with the culture as far as possible and become invisible kind of thing. So I think it's a bit of both in a way. I think it's the worship thing is an aesthetic thing, but I think he's very much kind of actually wanting Christians to be distinctive, whatever their tradition is, when it comes to where they place themselves in culture.
And that might be an interesting thing, just thinking out loud, really, that might be an interesting thing about where we see church growth happening in the UK church, which is often amongst Pentecostal churches and
I think
they're unapologetic, I guess.
Exactly. I think that's interesting. Is that those are the growth ends of the church. I think it's the mushy middle where we're sadly seeing a kind of decline, and I think it's because people are drawn to something, whether it be a kind of hands in the air, closed eyes kind of Pentecostal, or a sort of very uber traditional Anglo-Catholic cathedral service. The reason those two ends seem to be experiencing some growth is, I think, because it's about the otherness of it, and people being invited into something that is clearly different to your everyday, and kind of takes you out of that. So I think there's something definitely for the church to learn from that. One of the big lessons that a lot of these secular thinkers, not just Tom Holland, but others, have said to me is, I don't particularly feel like I just want to join a church that just is parroting and mimicking the culture around it. Because I can, you know, I can go to the Coldplay concert if I want to hear great contemporary music. I can, you know, go to, you know, the secular humanists if I just want to hear nice moral advice for how I should live my life. They want something that actually feels different, you know, in that way.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, let's stick with that. What happens in our kind of services or expressions kind of thing. Duncan, can I call you in to ask the question that you were asking? You might need to unmute yourself, Duncan.
Yeah. Hi, Justin. Thank you for your time today. Oftentimes when we gather together as leaders, it's 5 practical ways in which you can do this. And so it's so refreshing just to take a 30,000 kind of foot view of what God is doing and the kind of temperature of spiritually of the nation. And so, yeah, like everybody else, love the pod, love the book, love that you've taken time to speak to us. I'm just thinking about most of us here are preachers, and you know, you're talking about this shift that people are beginning to feel that God is making sense of their very existence, their value and their purpose. And I think we would all resonate with that. But how would you suggest that would change the way we sit down and prepare our talks for Sunday and how we deliver our talks on a Sunday? With that in mind, with this shifting culture in mind, how should it change the series we put together in church, the posture we take from the pulpit, and the words we use? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably you're doing a great job anyway. Anyone who's part of this, you know, Further Faster network, I imagine is already quite culturally engaged and wants to be sort of speaking on the cutting edge and, you know, doing things that are culturally relevant in their services and through their preaching. I guess, or for me, it is about sometimes helping people to see that 30,000 feet view. Sometimes I think we can get quite sort of locked in to the current debates and issues in our church and culture, and sometimes, you know, and that's good. We want to be in a way for that. But I think one of the things I found certainly most helpful in sort of when I was pulling together this book and thinking about the issues was kind of zooming out and seeing the way that God has always worked through different times and places and cultures, and that kind of cycle of the death of the church and the rebirth of the church in various eras and places, and to kind of help people to realize that we're not the end result. Okay, we're just one part of the bigger picture of the kingdom that God is doing, and in a way that's almost takes the pressure off, because it's not up to us to kind of save our culture, and you know, there's something much bigger. There are far bigger forces than us that are happening, and God is much bigger as well. And just reminding people of that, I think, can be helpful sometimes. That there's a sort of, they're part of a much bigger story, and helping them to see that. I think the other thing is that story element is just helping people to see the ways in which I think what people certainly kind of when it comes to sort of more evangelistic preaching, I would say that one thing to consider is whether we need to dial back on the kind of classical apologetics kind of way of trying to reach people in the kind of, as I said, 4 proofs for the resurrection kind of thing, which there's still a place for, but and maybe start to take a leaf out of, as I say, some of these secular folks' books, of the fact that people are actually very engaged in really where the rubber hits the road for most people is in story. It's feeling like you're part of a narrative, and that's not something like that you just prove to someone. It's something that people just naturally feel like. So the psychologists say that, you know, if people don't feel like they're part of a kind of meaningful story of their life, if they feel like they're just bouncing around chaotically, effectively, that is what leads to depression and anxiety and everything else. And I think people are increasingly feeling like that the stories that they're living into aren't working out, and they're being told at the same time, you know, by the academics, especially the sort of the materialists, that you are literally just a cog in a machine. Basically, there is no ultimate purpose. You kind of don't have any agency. And so I think it's a really good opportunity to, as I say, to just remind people that there is a different vision of reality where you are part of a grand cosmic story, where you are not the star. God is the star. Jesus is the star, but you are part of a grand cosmic drama that kind of puts everything else into the shade and makes every single life, however ordinary or disappointing it may seem on the surface, actually part of something much bigger and more beautiful. So I don't know if that helps at all, but somehow kind of infusing your preaching with that idea of the beauty, the kind of the sense that people want to be part of something bigger, and that they really can be, that's what's being offered in the Christian story in that way.
Makes a huge amount of sense. And I think that's why Jordan Peterson connects really well with, especially with young men, is that I think in church oftentimes the call is follow Jesus, join a small group and be on our car park team and give us your money.
Yeah.
And for young men, it's like, well, where's the purpose in that?
Yeah.
You know, and yet when you see how Jesus called people to become fishers of men, to leave everything and will go win lost people on the cliff edge of doom for the kingdom, you know, that's where young men say, I'm in, you know, I'm in. And so I think you're right. I think stepping back and calling people to a bigger story than the story that they're hearing is powerful stuff. So thank you. Thank you. Brilliant.
Great question. Thank you so much. On a similar kind of note, actually, Matt Wolsey, I'm going to ask you to jump on and ask your question. Again, you need to unmute yourself, Matt, because actually it's on a not dissimilar kind of vein in terms of how we speak into all that you're uncovering, Justin. So, Matt, over to you.
Thanks. Which of my three questions were you citing in particular, Chris?
I'll leave it to you. I'll leave it to you to
okay.
think. I've got one here about
one.
God, Jesus, where we start with talking to people about the story.
All right, that's that one. So yeah, I noticed in the book and on the podcast so far, there's a lot about God and there's a much less about Jesus in particular. And being good evangelicals, we want to talk about Jesus, of course. Do you think I think you probably touched on this and maybe semi-answered it. Do you think we're presently in a climate where a more general philosophical discussion about theism is an easier way in than starting to talk about the person of Jesus in particular?
I think we are, because I think at this point I am sensing that people are kind of more open to the God thing than the very specifics at this point. So it probably is an easier entry point, I think. However, obviously, like you, I never want to just sort of leave it at God, because you have to ask which God, and the God we want to reveal to people is the God revealed in Jesus Christ. So it's interesting, even with the Jordan Peterson thing, where he, you know, his next book is going to be called, I think, We Who Wrestle with God. There's a lot of kind of God talk going on, but even with him, I think it's interesting the way that you know, I've heard him speak in a number of arenas about the way Jesus is the kind of personification of, you know, human vulnerability and heroism and sacrifice and love and everything else. He's not got to the point where he kind of identifies Jesus with God, interestingly. But I feel like that's obviously where we need to bring people to the point of, I certainly don't want just a lot of people who are interested in theism at the end of this. I want people who see that God took flesh. The podcast will start to major in a bit more on Jesus in the next few episodes, which are specifically about the Bible, and we're going to be looking at we're going to be doing some more of that more classical apologetics in some of the coming episodes, where we look at the evidence for Jesus and the resurrection and so on. But that obviously is where, you know, I want people to get to. And if we're talking about story, I think the whole point of the story of the Christian God is that he stepped into the story. And so for me, that's got to sort of be the next place we take people. But I'm happy if they're willing to just start talking about God. That's fine by me, because that's a heck of a lot further on than we were in the new atheist phase, when, you know, 100%. That was just being dismissed out of hand. So for me, it's a gift, and let's use it, you know.
Thank you. Good comment. Can I, while Chris is allowing me to talk, can I have my other question as well?
Go on, Matt. Go on. Nicely done, can I say?
You've got a real strength around combining intellectual rigor and gentleness. I think that really comes out in your stuff. So
thank you
for that. Have you got any tips for people doing this? One, in preaching, which is obviously a bit of a different communication form, but also in everyday conversation. So helping people in our churches do that in their everyday chat. And I'm thinking particularly with non-academic people. So I will consume a lot of reading, listening to things, but a lot of people in our church won't. We're not in a university town, so it's a bit of a different, people are not engaging with this stuff in quite the same way, but may interact with people who are. So just any thoughts on, one, in preaching, and two, in everyday conversation?
Yeah, I guess it's always going to be about, trimming your material for the audience you've got. And I obviously am aiming this podcast and book at people who are sort of specifically interested in this and kind of maybe want to go into the sort of more deep dive sort of cultural theological issues and everything else. But like, I just was watching the BAFTAs on Sunday night, and it was interesting to me that Samantha Morton, who accepted the BAFTA fellowship, said in her acceptance speech, "I believe in God." And she then sort of talked about how faith and forgiveness kind of feature in some of the movies that she's been involved in. And I just thought, I mean, that's a great little preaching point, isn't it? Just taking something, just a short thing in our culture, but it's just, for me, another little indication of the way that kind of God's creeping back into public conversations, things. And that might just be the way in for someone who, isn't necessarily interested in these bigger, wider topics about secular intellectuals and so on, but they might think, oh yeah, that was an interesting comment that someone made at the BAFTAs the other day. So I don't know, it might be things like that, that are the way in. I mean, in terms of how to sort of have those conversations with people who are perhaps not Christians or in context, I guess for me, both with the book and the podcast, I hoped at least that both of them could be listened to by a non-Christian without it feeling completely alien or like they were listening to a Christian podcast. Now it is obviously, I don't in any way hide that I'm a Christian and that I'm doing this sort of for Christian purposes, that I have a faith and, a hope that people will come to faith through it. But I guess, especially through hosting lots of shows between Christians and atheists over the years, it's inculcated in me a little bit of a sense of wanting to always be thinking about the audience and asking what questions are they thinking, what assumptions are they coming to this with, and trying to, as far as I can within the documentary and book, phrase things in ways that aren't sort of, don't assume that the person listening has a faith themselves. And I think that's quite helpful for us generally to try and do, to kind of trying to put yourself in the shoes of your potential listener or whoever, and how can you land something best without kind of making someone feel like they've done something wrong or they're excluded if they just don't happen to share the assumption you have about God and Jesus and that kind of thing. So I think to some extent that is just practice. I think you got to go and have conversations and make mistakes before you find out actually what works and what doesn't work in the end when it comes to doing that. But that's probably my advice on that one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. That's great questions. You got 2 of your 3, so we'll let you stop there. Paul Valler's got a great question about different age groups and how this is affecting different age groups. So, Paul, can we bring you in to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Justin. Yeah, my question is about the 18 to 35 age bracket in particular. I mean, many in this group are leaving church and so-called deconstructing their faith. And so my question is, do you feel that the turn of the tide that you've started to observe here is affecting differing age groups differently? And what would be, in your view, now the most effective way to engage with this 18 to 35-year-old emerging generation?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because I think it depends on which demographic you're looking at, because the deconstruction side obviously is really referring to people who have grown up in church or, had some sort of Christian faith and are deconstructing it, leaving it, rejecting it in some cases. And that's specifically, a phenomenon that I see far more in kind of church circles in the USA, where a kind of certain type of Christian culture is kind of being questioned, basically, especially in an age where you can, you know, connect with so many people, and it's harder to live in a Christian bubble than it used to be, and all that sort of thing. Deconstruction does happen in the UK as well, obviously, but we're in a very different place to the US, where the average 18 to 35-year-old probably never went to church, and is, you know, has a very kind of tenuous, probably, understanding of what Christianity is even.
Yeah.
So I think, and those are the ones, in my opinion, who are turning up for Jordan Peterson. Now, there's probably a good number of Christians or deconstructing Christians among that audience as well, people who are kind of looking for a different way in some way to Christian faith, or appreciate the kind of the way that Jordan Peterson's putting it across. But I do think there's a sense in which there's a kind of, in the UK, kind of where the secularization has kind of gone that much further than in the US, it is actually an opportunity to speak into a more receptive crowd who almost don't have the baggage of the church, and sort of the disappointments and things that obviously a certain number of people do have with it. At the same time, I think for those who are in, you know, the 18 to 35-year-olds, who are the kind of the deconstruction kind of crowd, though I'd say that actually that crowd easily stretches into the 40s and 50s as well. I think, I mean, I don't necessarily see it as such a bad thing, in the sense that I think it's a natural result of people, of the fact that the way we're communicating has changed dramatically in the last 15 or 20 years. And I do see a lot of deconstruction going on, but I don't see it, most of them aren't deconstructing into kind of some hard atheism. They're deconstructing things, but a lot of them are still leaving the door open for there being some kind of spiritual reality. And a lot of them are actually deconstructing and then reconstructing. I do see a lot of people who are kind of somewhere in the middle, but are actually on a journey towards putting it all together again. And in my experience, when you put it together again, you end up with something a lot more robust than what you deconstructed. I think a lot of as I say, a lot of the deconstruction stories are coming out of the US, and they're very specific to a kind of evangelical church subculture, which probably was overdue for a lot of aspects of it being questioned.
Yeah.
And the problem is, if you think that sometimes we sort of imagine that these things are potentially bigger than they are. I think that's a very specific slice of a particular bit of the church in a particular moment, where people are kind of having these questions and turning things over. And actually, I think on the other side of that, you'll probably find something quite healthy, which is the church learning some lessons from why people rejected, you know, religion for all, because the church took probably some wrong turns. And my hope is that in itself becomes part of the wider movement of actually people coming back to the true story, you know, the real heart of what the Christian message is. So I hope that helps in some way. And I do think, but what I would say as well is that I don't use much, like all of, as I said, all of the statistics seem to show the decline of Christianity, church going, and religious affiliation in the West. But interestingly, just some of the latest statistics do seem to be bucking that trend in the youngest age groups.
Right.
And that's the most de-churched age groups, and where you are actually seeing an openness to God, to prayer. And I saw some fascinating statistics recently in, I think it was in Finland, where there's been a doubling of the number of young men attending church in the last 5 years. And that's weird. And it's specifically men, interestingly, doesn't apply to women. But I feel like there's something happening in that younger age group, which isn't yet looking like bums on seats in churches necessarily a lot of the time. But I feel like they're the ones who are now, because they've been the kind of victims basically of this digital kind of atomized meaning crisis age, they're the ones who are actually just about to become the most open to the Christian story again. Whereas I think a lot of the older generation, because they almost think they know what Christianity is, they're not open to it in a funny way.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, thanks, Paul. Great question. And Justin, that's, yeah, really got us thinking on that. That's great. Along again, just similar-ish lines. Matt, can we get you in, because actually you had a question about the attractiveness of the Jordan Peterson kind of a thing, which kind of again speaks into that young men thing we were just we were referencing there. Justin, Matt, over to you.
Yeah, I was wondering the when Jordan Peterson started drawing these huge crowds, especially of young men, and like you say, speaking very unapologetically. I mean, like going through the whole Genesis story and doing a big thing on Exodus that they've just done. I think a lot of churches and church leaders looked at that and thought, he's done the impossible. We've been trying to draw these people towards God and towards church for decades now and kind of struggled, and all the statistics said struggled. And yet Jordan Peterson's filling out auditoriums and millions of people watch his videos. Would you say that this is a bit of an invitation, or maybe even a challenge for church to maybe shift their model if we're finding it hard to do the kind of things and reach the kind of people that people like Jordan Peterson are reaching with the gospel at the moment?
I think what it should tell us is that people want quite serious stuff. I think sometimes the danger is we reduce our invitation to a kind of very sort of like make it as kind of bite-sized and attractive and sort of like fluffy as possible, almost, in the hopes that it won't put people off by being too kind of serious. But I think the thing that's really the reason Jordan Peterson, I think, attracts so many people, especially young men, is because he takes them very seriously. And whether or not you agree with, you know, his takes on things, what he does do is he kind of takes people really seriously intellectually, and as kind of and kind of almost in terms of them, their soul, you know, that it's like he's really, you know, he will burst into tears on stage at various points because he's so passionate about helping people, like wanting to help these young men to experience, you know, true responsibility and flourishing and everything else. And I just think that gets through to people. I think it's like it connect. The reason I don't think people necessarily come just because he's got interesting ideas about the Bible and God and that sort of thing. It's because they feel like he's really taking them seriously. And I think and he doesn't sort of doesn't, what's the word I'm looking for? He doesn't sort of water that down in the sense of kind of and I guess if there's anything that could teach us, it's that you know, there is a place obviously for, you know, some kind of evangelistic sermon that's full of jokes and full of like cultural allusions and, you know, has a great evangelistic skit attached to it or something. That's going to work for some people, but actually a lot of these young men, they're listening to kind of these like 3-hour Joe Rogan podcasts and things where kind of people are going into some specific niche thing, like really in depth, and they're kind of intense, and they want that like they want to feel like they're being invited into something that's quite important and deep, kind of like one of the previous questions was saying. They want to kind of be invited into some kind of grand adventure, you know. And I think that's what has been so attractive for whatever reason for Jordan Peterson. So I think churches could do more of that, kind of really sort of saying, like, you know, I mean, some of the, again, and I don't want to say this is just a male female thing, but like some of the most popular kind of, you know, men's gatherings that I've seen sort of informally taking place have been ones where they've just gathered to kind of like, let's talk about Augustine or something. And it's like they take something quite serious and meaty and theological and just kind of go for it. And for whatever reason, everyone has a fabulous time. And it's not necessarily the normal thing you might expect is kind of, now that might just be as much about, you know, the specific demographics. It's obviously it's not going to work for everyone. And most churches, obviously on an average Sunday, they're trying to speak to a very wide number of different people. And you know, you'd probably lose half your congregation if you preach for 3 hours on the book of Genesis. But the point is, there is a kind of, if you can find that group and you're wanting to reach them, then there's definitely something there about kind of really treating the depth and the seriousness they want seriously, you know.
Thanks.
Right. And Justin, we've got 3 or 4 more minutes before we just kind of wrap up. So can you tell us in 3 minutes who Molly Worthen is and why?
Oh, sorry.
Why that's important? Steve Benning asked that question.
Why don't I quickly share Molly's image again? So Molly is a really interesting person. I'll just scroll down to her image here. I met her only about 8 months ago, actually, and I don't tell her story in the book because her story only came to me more recently. But you will hear her story in some forthcoming episodes of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And Molly is, again, one of these very surprising stories of someone who's come to faith against all the odds, because she is a professor of religion, specifically in the area of North American religion at the University of North Carolina. And she has been basically documenting the good, the bad, and the ugly of North American church for the last decade and a half. And as a journalist as well, writing for the New York Times, the Atlantic, and other outlets about it. And she'd kind of always basically just been an agnostic, pretty much all of her adult life, kind of attracted at some level to, again, a sort of Anglo-Catholic kind of sort of ascetic of Christianity. But basically, you know, she told me with a view that, well, wouldn't it be nice if it were true, but not believing that it was. And then only a couple of years ago, she was put on an assignment to do a profile of J.D. Greer, who's basically a megachurch pastor in North Carolina. And in the process of that, he kind of challenged her to get off the agnostic fence and to look into whether the story of Jesus could be taken seriously. And she kind of took him at his word. He gave her homework. She ended up being put in touch with people like N.T. Wright and Tim Keller at the time with some of her questions. So she went straight to the top. But this was a process where her kind of expectations kind of got completely confounded, because she had kind of bought into this idea that, well, we don't really know who Jesus was, what happened. And she found that actually there is really good scholarship that tells us that we can know what happened and that these accounts are reliable and that something happened that birthed the Christian church. And she came to the conclusion that what those first followers said happened is what happened, that Jesus rose from the dead. And so she was baptized only about a year and a half ago in J.D. Greer's church. The last place, again, she expected to be baptized was in a megachurch, you know, but that's where she's found her spiritual home. And so it's just another really surprising story of the way in which, you know, skeptical, secular intellectuals can come to faith in quite surprising ways. So I hope that's an encouraging story, perhaps, to finish our time with.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you read my mind. I was just going to say, what a great story to finish our time together on. That's fantastic. But we want to say, and lots of people coming in on the chat to say thank you so much, both for your time today, but also for this work that you're doing, actually, which I think is certainly, you know, we are finding, and I know many other people on this conversation today are just finding so helpful, encouraging at a personal level about our faith in what has felt like an increasingly de-Christian world. So I think we're finding it personally so encouraging, but also actually as people involved in leading churches, encouraging, inspiring, and challenging to us in, you know, how we respond to a changing culture. So thank you for that work that you're doing. Thank you for the work that you've done before as well. Around here, we're huge fans of the Ask N.T. Wright Anything podcast. We still talk about that a lot as well. So just encourage people on the call, if you haven't checked out some of Justin's other stuff, which I know is kind of in the archives now a little bit, I guess we could say, but it's still such a valuable tool and resource. So thank you for your time. Thank you being with us this afternoon. And just to encourage people, Justin, I don't know whether you can say this or I can say it, you can get signed copies of the book from the website. We're posting the links now. You can support the work that Justin's doing now, and including this podcast and other resources like it, again, through the website. And I think we really want to encourage people to do that. And I think you said earlier on, still spaces available for the event with Tom Holland. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, Tuesday the 5th of March. If you can come to London, be there at Westminster Chapel, and there's links again from the podcast page on my website, or go to licc.org.uk who are hosting the event. They've got the details there as well.
Right. So have I said all that needs to be said about that? Just anything else you want to encourage us
No,
to
I think
look at?
I'll employ you as my PR agent going forward, because that was a great summary of where people can find everything. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Right. Well, that's brilliant. And we're going to continue to listen to the podcast and can't wait for those next episodes. And and again, just to encourage people on this call, I think encourage people in our churches to be listening to it and engaging with it as well, because it's I was about to say it's an easy listen. That sounds like I'm doing it down, but I hope you know what I mean in the best possible senses of the word, and great for people in our churches to get into. So I was talking to a deputy head teacher from a primary school who is part of our church community, and she was just talking to me, and basically what she was expressing was some of the stress she was feeling about being in an environment that feels like this very divergent cultural thing that you expressed so clearly. So I pointed her to the podcast, and she is finding it so helpful.
Oh, that's great. It's absolutely, it's the best thing I ever hear when people just talk about telling other people about it, because that's the most amazing kind of thing that can happen. So yeah, please do. Obviously share it on your social media, but I just find word of mouth is still one of the best ways to spread the message. So thank you very much indeed.
Great. Well, thank you for being with us. Thanks everybody else for being with us. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions today, but thank you for those who jumped on and answered those. And we'll look forward to catching up with you again really, really soon. And if you're a visitor to the Further Faster Network, go and check us out as well, or have conversations with us. We'd love to talk to you a little bit more about the work of the network as well. Great. Thanks everybody. Thanks again, Justin. And
thank you, guys.
See you all soon. Cheers.